Okay, so we've done all this stuff with scraping data. That is pulling the data from a website using a method that isn't exactly best practice. I mean, it's a good way to get around things. And when I say get around things, that is if there isn't something called an API available or a public API available, then you have to kind of use scraping. But public APIs are available. In fact, we're going to see the future of pretty much every sort of web service having a very, very strong API. Yelp has an API, as we've already seen Yelp on the front end and what we've done scraping there. But so does Facebook, so does Twitter, so does Instagram. Pretty much every major service that has a big community in general has an API of some kind. And if they don't have an API themselves, they most likely use somebody else's API, right? So like if you're ever on another website and you're doing a search and you might get restaurants or some sort of location-based service, there's a really good chance that they're using Yelp's API. Now, they might be using a different location API, like Google has one as well, but the chances are pretty good that they're using Yelp or somebody else's API if they don't have their own especially. What the API is, it allows your software to actually work with another database. So somebody else's software. So it's basically your server communicating with another server and using an API to do that. That's essentially what it is. So when we do an API, we use it just as we would as a normal human would, right? So if I was going into Yelp, I would go to yelp.com. So I'm searching, I'm doing this request on Yelp, and then I would search for something like, let's say, food near Irvine, California. And this is the search that would come out, right? And this would give me these food options, right? This is as a human doing it. Notice it's not that fast, but it is also very designed. It's made for a very pleasant user experience, a human experience. Now, what APIs are made for is a very pleasant developer experience, one, ideally, and then number two, it's made for just data interchange. It's not really meant to be this fancy, cool looking thing. It's really just about the core data. Just like when we did when we actually scraped the data, once we had the data locally in our own little CSV file, that was just like data. It wasn't pretty looking. It was just data. Of course, we could have made it look pretty, but really what it came down to is it is just that core data. And APIs allow us to do that. That's essentially what it's all about, is connecting two different pieces of software together through something called an API. And of course, you can build your own API. That's actually something we cover in the Django REST framework projects that we have on joincfv.com/projects. But you could also see that APIs themselves are just widely used everywhere. And to find APIs, a lot of times what you'll do is go to the actual bottom of the web page, and on the footer there'll be something like developers or API related things. So as far as Yelp is concerned, yelp.com/developers, that has a actual place for the API itself. But in this case, we have it where Yelp is already loaded up for us. And so that's essentially where we're going to be starting in this one. There's actually not a whole lot that we actually have to do. I just wanted this brief little introduction so you guys can understand the general overview of what APIs are. If you want more specific questions, definitely check out joincfv.com/knock and ask your API related questions there, where we could dive into it a little bit more. So what you want to do here is create an account and actually log in. So if you already have a Yelp account, definitely log in or sign up for a new one. It's free. That's just something we need to actually get started. And the first thing that you want to do is go to the Manage API Access. Here is the API keys. Now these keys are very similar to a password, like your own sort of password. But in this case, the keys are something that you're obviously not going to want to share, right? So you don't share these keys with any third party, as it says here. So if you read through their terms of use, there's probably other things that you can't do. But basically, it's for your protection. Just like you don't want to give out your password, you don't want to give out your API keys either. So these API keys are the way that your application authenticates, or as in logs in with Yelp. Where when you authenticate, you just use your email and your password. In this case, we have 4 different things that allow us to do this. Now, the consumer key and the consumer secret are related to our quote unquote application. The token and the token secret are related much more to the authentication. The way that we actually store these things and share them is very much different depending on what you're working in. But if you're using Django, you would put it in the settings file most likely, but even better, you would put it inside of environment variables. So you would use it in your application that way. But that's getting a little bit out of the way here. So let's actually get this thing going, and we're going to be doing it using Python requests again. So Python requests is the actual way we're going to be going about doing this. And since it has API keys, we have to do authentication. That means Python requests isn't going to do what we did before. Instead, we actually have to inject our password, our username and password, to make it work. And we're using OAuth. So that's OAuth is something that Yelp uses. Of course, if you went through the documentation, you could see that. So if you click on documentation, authentication, you would see that it uses OAuth 1.0 for authenticating. So in Python requests, it has a OAuth 1 authentication library or some support for it. Well, actually, there's another library that does it, so we can actually use that library to do our authentication stuff. And notice it does already have an example there for you. But before we actually jump into authentication, I just want to show you the search API. So this is going back to something very similar to what we did when we manually did the search, when we were web scraping the actual user front end. So what you see here is an endpoint, right? So this is the URL that we're going to be working with. I'll show you what this means in a second. And then we have a bunch of different search parameters. Now with our actual web scraping that we did before, you could actually make these same sort of parameters on your own. It's just going to take a lot of hacking and just different things that you would need to do. But this right here are different parameters. We'll show you how to use that. And then finally, what you see, if you go down a little bit further, you see a sample request. So the sample request is showing you how these different parameters might work and what they would look like, right? So we have term here and so on. So I see that there's this URL. Let me just go ahead and copy this URL and open it up inside of Chrome. What I see right here is I get an error. One or more parameters are missing in request. Missing parameter, that's the OAuth consumer key. So it's actually not authenticating, but we can actually play around with this on our own inside of code instead of copying and pasting it. So let's go ahead and open up Sublime Text. I'm going to open a new document here. I'm going to go ahead and save this document into my scrape virtual environment. The only reason I'm putting it into that virtual environment is because we already have a lot of stuff installed there. And I'm just going to call this yelp_api.py. This, of course, is just for reference documentation. It's not really for anything other than that. Like if you're following along with us, you don't really need this code, but it's there for you if you want it, and it's going to be on our repository, of course, on joincfe.com/GitHub. Okay, so we have this URL. Let's actually copy this URL here, and I'm going to paste it in and just say URL equals to this string, right? And I want to import requests. So this is going back to what we've already done. This is something very similar to what we've already done. And I'll just say r equals to request.get this URL. Okay, so let's go ahead and open up our Python shell. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this stuff in here. And I'm going to print r.status code. And I'll also print r.text. Okay, so here are the two different things that are coming through here. We've got a 400 status code, which is usually means there's an error, right? It's an error type of status code. What we want to see is a 200. But using this URL, this is what happens. So this is how you might see these errors come about. This would also happen if you, for some reason, didn't pass in the parameters correctly. So since we're missing the OAuth consumer key, let's actually add in those authentication parameters as it requires. So going back into the Yelp API, I'm just going to go to Manage API Access, and I'm going to click on these keys. Notice that you can see my keys. This is, of course, just so you can learn from it. These keys will definitely not work by the time you try them. So if you copy and paste these, or like literally from the video, it's not going to work. And you might as well just do it on your own anyway, because it's a lot faster that way. Okay, so let me go ahead and paste these into my Python file. I'm going to put them at the top, actually. And I'm just going to pause the video real quick and turn these into strings as well as underscores. And there we go. So that is actually what you want it to look like. So notice I put strings or quotes on the outside. I want to be consistent here, so I'm going to use single quotes all across the board. Double quotes are probably preferred, but let's use the single quotes for this one. Okay, so I've got those keys here, and now I can actually add this authentication stuff to my request. But it's not really as simple as just adding in these keys on this request library. In fact, I need another library that I need to install into my virtual environment. So I'm going to go ahead and exit and do pip freeze. I need that requests OAuth library. So I'll do pip install, and it's requests -OAuth lib. We'll go ahead and press enter. Of course, you can always use the documentation that they have, OAuth authentication, and here's the request stuff. You can go to that library or just copy this right here and do pip install that way. That's what I end up usually doing. I'm not usually memorizing the names of all of the libraries that I work with. I mean, of course, the big ones that I use, I definitely memorize, but I use them so often, so that's that. This is a good time for a little break. We're going to pick it up right at where we're at, right here in the next one. See you there.